So welcome. This is John P. Milton, and he is the. Is this on? It's just being recorded. So okay, right in there we go. Really close. Kiss the mic. So this is John P. Milton. He's the founder of the Way of Nature and Sacred Passage, and today it's the sacred sites of Crestone as a topic. John, as many of you may know, if not, he is I think, considered a genuine grandfather or father of the modern environmental movement. And is a little peek at his background is that he was the first professional ecologist ever on staff at the White House as a member of Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors as a deep ecologist. So you can imagine how that was disruptive to the normal proceedings of Washington, D.C., and he, with his colleagues, co-authored the National Environmental Policy Act, which laid the groundwork for the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the EPA. And in this day, we need all of that energy to be refocused and honor the sacredness of virtually everything in both the seen and the unseen realms. So with that, John, you can add whatever I might have skipped over.
Okay, thank you. Well, great to see some Crestonites and near Crestonites here today. How many of you have actually been up and spent time with some of the sacred sites, the beds, the seats, and some of these ancient locations here? So about half of you. To give you a quick summary, I should mention that I got here in the late 70s, and at that time there was almost nothing known about from the outside world, the non-indigenous world, about the sacredness of Crestone and why people came here for thousands of years. They knew it was supposed to be a power spot and a place where the indigenous people would come for renewal, for rejuvenation, but nobody really understood why and what were the details, what makes this place so special. And when I got here, we had originally planned to build a small eco-village just to the north of Crestone. And that village, we were going to use a lot of the stones that were washed down from the glaciers to build many of the houses and have solar masts that would collect the solar energy from each of these sites. I think a pretty good idea. Still think it would be very, very nice, but I was taught by my grandparents, before you do anything that affects nature and affects the earth, that it's very, very important to do a deep, ideally a vision quest, and make a connection to the earth, and then ask what would the earth itself and what would nature like to do? What's nature's instructions for us humans? So I remembered that, and I got together with my little community of, I think there were 6 of us, and I went up and did a vision quest at the headwaters of North Crestone Creek here in Crestone. A beautiful area called Groundhog Basin, lots of groundhogs. At the end of that quest, I was given very clear instructions that I was to go back to the land in question, and then to all of the information that I asked for would come through at that time. So I went back, had a very nice sleep. During a vision quest, you don't sleep. No food, no water, no shelter, no sleep. It's different than a sacred passage. It's very gentle. A tent. You're going to eat lightly or fast, your choice. And you can sleep as much as you need to. So it was kind of nice to get back and have a little nap. Then the next morning I got up and was literally pulled by spirit kind of taken by the shoulder and taken off into the forest. And I was pulled over to this rock. And it was a really beautiful rock came up out of the forest. It looked almost like a chair. And I walked over to it, looked at it more closely, and it was a chair. The top of it was carved in a beautiful U shape that would hold your butt very nicely. Then it faced an area that had a whole series of stones that were laid out in an arrangement with some stones separated with a pathway between them, other triangular and diamond-shaped stones that looked like they were moving the energy. I should say I had been teaching Tai Chi and Qigong for probably 30, 40 years before that. So I was not unfamiliar with energy flows. And I could feel that there was something happening from that chair through those lines of energy that the stones laid out. I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. And so I sat there for a while, and after a bit, I began to feel a really strong shift in my own energy field. And I could feel a kind of a different energy, a different kind of quality fill me. That particular seat we now call the throne. And it's really, when you sit in it, you're very erect, have really good vertical alignment just because of the way the chair itself is arranged. Let's get this out of the way. And quite a beautiful sight. So I sat in there a little bit longer, and I began to feel like I was getting a bit of a download of some sort. And then Spirit came before I had finished and said, okay, enough here. And I was taken to another one. And this time it was a very different kind of a spot. It was actually a bed in the earth, and the stones were arranged to make a really nice place to lie down on your back, gazing into the sky. As I did that, I remembered that I'd been trained by some of my teachers from the Dzogchen tradition, particularly for something called sky gazing, where you gaze into the sky and let your mind merge with the vastness, the boundlessness, the spaciousness of the sky, and merge with that kind of vast outer sky. And then when you really do that, that opens up an internal sky, which is very kind of a boundless inner sky. And then those two, you fall back into a more deep level of sky-like awareness at the root of yourself. And the main challenge with that practice is falling asleep, because you're lying down and gazing into the sky. And normally you fall asleep then. Plus you have nothing to focus on in the open sky except space and clarity and light. So the really nice thing about this particular bed was that the energy, it supported moving energy through the core of my body, what's called the central channel. And that central channel began to fire up, and the energy began to move from the base root chakra up to the crown and then out. And that kept me awake. So the deeper I dropped into the gazing into the sky, the more I was able to rest in a state of natural openness and clarity. Pretty straightforward. So I stayed there for maybe another 20 minutes, really just enjoying the feeling of inner spaciousness, boundlessness, and kind of a sky-like quality of being. And thought, wow, the ancient ones that built this place really knew what they were doing. I didn't know, I'd never heard of a place that would be a stone bed that would open up the energy body in such a way that it would open up your channels and your meridians and your, in this case, the central channel is one of the 8 extraordinary vessels in the human body. The Chinese have mapped it out. They call it the Chong vessel. So I was a bit familiar with it from my Taoist practice. So I then got pulled to another place. This time it was a beautiful seat again, but this was interesting because it had a beautiful pink stone shaped like an egg, and then a long stone shaped almost a phallic shape, but actually it was, when I looked at it carefully, I saw it was actually a stone dolphin. A perfect dolphin head the forehead curved down into the bill of the dolphin, and then that angled off, and it was sort of like a stone dolphin leaping out of the earth into the sky. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. So I sat on the pink stone, which is right in front of the stone dolphin, and then began to drop into a state of what felt to me like either being a dolphin or swimming with a herd of dolphins. Later on, I had a guest here who had spent much of her life with a dolphin pod in Hawaii, Joan Ocean. And she sat in that seat and began to feel, when she sat there, she began to cry and said, this feels just like swimming with my favorite pod of dolphins back in Hawaii. So it's a nice confirmation. Some years later. So those were the first 3 seats, and then I got taken to some other ones. Each one was unique, had a different look to it, had a different kind of a context, and by the end of the day, I had been taken to about 80 different stone meditation seats and beds, which were naturally, these are not just things that were where stones were dumped there by the glacier. These were carefully articulated, put together by the ancient ones, and set up in such a way that they would move the energy through the energy body, through the chakras, the acupuncture meridians, and the 8 extraordinary vessels of the body, in such a way that it would support an opening of the energy body and a different kind of perception. So by the end of that day, I realized that we had a very different thing than I had originally thought we were going to be doing. Originally, we were going to build an eco-village there. But it's pretty clear Mother Nature had some other thoughts about that spot. And I went back to my partners. Half of them said, wow, that's fantastic, John. What a gift. And then came out and spent time there. The other half said, oh, what a shame. I mean, we can't build our little house on the edge of the stream where we had planned to. We're in that nice little gathering of boulders over there. And the plan of gathering all the stones for solar mass to capture the heat from passive solar. Stones had some other ideas for where they wanted to be and how we could be with them. So that began the opening of a different kind of shamanic journey, which had not been really, none of this kind of stuff I just mentioned is part of the knowledge of the archaeological world. And I was lucky enough to have a student who's a senior archaeologist with the Smithsonian, and she and I began to look at some of these sites and begin to do some preliminary dating using lichen analysis, the rate at which a lichen grows on a stone. And you can tell by the rate at which that lichen grows out from the center, you can get a rough idea of the age of that particular stone complex. So we're able to date some of the seats by actually measuring the rate of this lichen growth. And the ages we got were at a minimum, most of the seats were at least 1,000 years old, and many of them looked like they were much older, up into multiple thousands of years. So very ancient stuff. But then there were some that were a few that were more contemporary, but not many, just a few. So this was in 2000. I have to jump back in time here. 1979. And then I spent 22 years in retreat in the little cabin in the middle of this mixture of these stone seats and rock beds. And each day I would go out. I would often go out to just have a 10-minute walk into these beautiful stone gardens and wander back to my cabin maybe 3 or 4 hours later, completely stoned, naturally stoned. No pot needed. And so I spent literally over 2 decades just spending time with these different sacred sites. And it turned, at the end of that period of time, I found at least 2,000, rough estimate now is we have at least 2,000 of these stone beds and seats. And we've been working very hard to raise funds to preserve the property that holds the bulk of these meditation seats. I should mention that each of these seats is in a configuration that is in harmony with the flow of the meridians. The Earth has meridians just like our human body does, where the energy flows across the Earth and then intersects with other energy flows, and you get a cross, like an X. And at those places where the two meridians cross, very often a stone seat is placed. And that's where you get a very strong download. We then began to take it a little further and discovered that many of the seats had connections into the sky. And I began to, just by using myself as a means for testing the effect of these seats, I would try them at different times in different constellations passing overhead, different planets coming into connection overhead and rising on the horizon line, and began to get an understanding that most of these seats and beds also had a connection into different constellations. And that deepened the mystery even further. So over time, I realized that I had inherited what effectively was a postgraduate school for shamans, and a part of archaeology that has never been made public. And that's kind of where we stand today. The area that we're talking about is north of Crestone. We now have been able to preserve some hundreds of acres of land, just a few hundred. And because it's such a new thing, very hard to raise money to preserve places like this. So I put a lot of my retirement savings into protecting this land. Media Bell here was one of the early supporters of Sacred Land Sanctuary. You remember those days? In the beginning, yeah?
It was a very modest contribution.
Yes.
But at the time, it was significant to me.
Yes, very much to you.
Say that again.
I said it was a very modest contribution, but at the time it was very significant to me because I was being a waitress at the Roadkill Cafe at the time, and not a lot of tips in Crestone.
It's true. Yeah, I'm not sure how we got by economically. I think I was on between $2,000 and $5,000 a year budget. Yeah. But lucky to have 22 years of deep retreat just north of the town and living with these amazing seats. Part of it is the seats are so thick you could not walk more than 100 feet in any direction without bumping into something. And one area we had so many, I nicknamed it Stone Heaven, because when you walk out there, there's just seat after seat, bed after bed, everywhere. And so it's quite something to have something like this in the modern community of Crestone. Of course, a few people occasionally come to me and say, "John, we've heard that there's some special rocks up your way." And I say, "Yeah, there is." And then the invitation is really to how to introduce that. And so we've been lately just picking out a weekend once a month where we invite people to come and do what we call the sacred walk, or the pilgrimage walk through these sacred sites. Now, the density of the energy meridians and the acupuncture lines of the earth, the vessels of the earth, in the Sacred Land Sanctuary, which is what we call this area up here, I'd say the density is probably 10 times larger than any place I've seen elsewhere in Colorado. The area around Crestone in general has maybe a tenth of the density of the seats that we have up here at the sanctuary, but they're all over the place, all over Crestone. And then Crestone in general has a density of seats and beds that I would say is roughly 10 times higher than you'd find generally around Colorado overall. Especially important to go into areas where there's been fewer bulldozers, fewer machines moving things around, and places that are not where wilderness and nature has been left wild and free, left to unfold in its own way, under its own patterns. But I mentioned the additional sites here in Crestone because I've noticed over the years, as the place has become more popular, that we've had more and more folks moving in, and very few people even know about these seats and beds and the meridian lines of the earth. And so we occasionally encourage people to come and learn about that. I think for several years, maybe every 3 years, I would offer a training just in how to locate and experience the stone meditation sites, so that when people come and build, put in a road, put in a driveway, put in a foundation, they don't destroy the very nature of the sacredness of this land, which actually very often brought people here. Be a shame if we destroyed most of the sacredness of this place just because we were ignorant of the deep sacredness of this place. We all feel it, but how is it actually, what makes that up? What's the means by which that sacredness expresses itself and can be touched into? So that's what we specialized in the way of nature over the years. And I think we've come up with a pretty good understanding of what they are, where they are, how they function, even in some cases how to repair damage after it's been done. We had one family came in one time, hired a couple of German folks to help them with their stonework around their house. I went down, we have a kiva up in this Sacred Land Sanctuary, a classical kiva, and I was walking into my friend's house and looked down at my feet, and two of the main stones that made up the kiva were gone, and were now the threshold stones for entering into my friend's house. And I said, I think these were brought from the Sacred Land Sanctuary, and they're brought from a sacred site up there. And the owner said, "You sure?" I said, "I'm pretty sure. This is a very special stone that had been split in half. So half of the stone was still near the kiva in the sanctuary, and the other half was now a footstone to enter the house. And because it had been split in half, you could see the matrix within the stone. So I said, "Why don't you come with me? Let's take a little walk up there." I took him in, showed him the other half that was still in the sanctuary, and we could see by matching up a picture of the one he'd taken as his threshold stone and the one that was still in the sanctuary, it was a perfect fit. So he agreed to remove the stone from the threshold of the house, and we had to get a team of about 12 guys holding a big tarp to load the stone from the house, get it into a truck, and then to get the stone out through the forest back to its original location and replace it. The amount of energy and time it took to do that was really something. And it made me think even more deeply, how did they move these stones around to build these seats? That's still an open mystery, how that was accomplished. And we're seeing a lot of these kinds of things with the ancient stoneworks in Peru and South America. I worked for the Peruvian government for a while, doing some of the early surveys of Machu Picchu. And they moved stones from one side of the Machu Picchu Valley across a 4,000-foot deep canyon. Across that canyon to make many of the keystones in Machu Picchu. How did they do that? Still an open mystery. But we have our own local version of that mystery right here. So one of the things we've been doing lately is getting the word out about the sacred sites of Crestone and trying to provide an educational capacity so that if people want to build a house, build a driveway, build a foundation, they have the opportunity to work with us to locate the sacred sites of their land so they can integrate the building and the driveways and all that kind of thing in harmony with what was already given by nature at this place. And hopefully that will, over time, help in the preservation of the sacred feel that we all experience when we come here. I should mention that we've, over the years, slowly begun to use the sanctuary for retreats. So we have about a week of deep training, and then people have a week of complete solitude in nature with no contact with a human. And we do a little mark, and we actually tie knots, a series of 5 or 6 knots, and then each day a buddy person who's nearby comes in, unties a knot, sees the other person has untied their knot and they're doing fine. So over a period of a week, all the knots are untied by the end of the week. And symbolically, the knots or the ties that bind are unbound. And we've honored the deep connection to the sacredness of this place through a meditation retreat. And then at the end of that, people come out, we share, we do some training to how do you bring the depth of that retreat process, the connection to outer nature, the big family of all living things, inner nature, the truth of your shadow self, and then true nature, which is the source nature we all carry. How can we bring that back into our normal lives, our friends, our family, our loved ones, our enemies, our challenges? How can we skillfully integrate all that? So the sanctuary has become a place where we've done that now for we're pushing 6 years. And when I first arrived there, the guardians, the spiritual guardians of the place, were really pissed off. Can you guess why? Well, this was a little mining town, which means they were digging out the gold, the silver, the other minerals, messing with the rocks. And not to say that messing with rocks is always bad. I love rocks myself. But there was no process of honoring, no ceremony, no way to show your respect and your appreciation for the gift of nature that you're receiving something from. So when we began to both preserve the land as is and the meditation seats as the first officially protected church of the earth or temple of the earth, aside from Native American culture in the U.S. As far as we know, it's the first time that's happened by modern contemporary people. First time. Isn't that amazing? I mean, we all love nature, but how do we express that? We don't consider Earth as a sacred place. And nature is a sacred place. Probably going back to the anti-pagan colonialists that came in from Europe with a very anti-nature perspective. In those days, Native Americans were called pagans. They were evil, worshippers of the devil, and completely off the path. Actually, it was the other way around. So slowly, we're beginning to learn the lesson that virtually all indigenous peoples have carried about the sacredness of nature itself as the foundational reality that we're all born from, and within which without which we cannot exist or live. So in a curious way, Sacred Land Sanctuary has become a bit of a model for how we can do that as modern hominids living in partnership with nature. How can we do that harmoniously? And have places where the ecosystem is left in a completely natural state, and we go there to honor it, do our prayers there, our ceremonies, our retreats, and begin to, out of that deep connectivity, establish new kind of relationship with nature. One of my students more recently has been working to help. I think she's going to be speaking just a few minutes after I finish. Janie Menke. She's going to be speaking on the Rights of Nature movement, which is very much in the same spirit of what I've been sharing about the Sacred Land Sanctuary. And we just finished the preservation of a Pyramid Hill in Crestone, which is the first Rights of Nature reserve, I think one of the first in the U.S. And of course we have Rights of Nature rivers, like in Ecuador. We have a Rights of Nature marsh, which was set aside recently in Spain. And we'd like to make the Sacred Land Sanctuary a place where it owns itself. Nature and Great Spirit are the owners of the property. Be a nice precedent. So that's a bit of the bigger picture of what we've been up to at the Sacred Land Sanctuary. The mayor, Benji, here at Crestone, I've been talking recently because the town of Crestone is about the same size as the Sacred Land Sanctuary. And Benji's main job is to work within the context of the human community that's assembled itself here in Crestone. And my job is to maintain the harmony of the sacred sites of just north of town on an equivalent piece of land, but we too have to learn how to govern in harmony with all of life, with a big family of all living things. So we've been talking about how to bring those two things together more. I think it'd be pretty cool. I've noticed over the years, and we just had a retreat there, as a 2-week sacred passage. People from all over the world, from China to all over Europe and so on. People come in and they enter the land, and one of the first things they say is, "This feels different." And we usually say, "What do you mean?" And they say, "Well, I feel kind of embraced." What is that? And I say, "Well, you're coming into a piece of land that for at least 6,000-7,000 years minimum, Native peoples have been coming in a sacred way to do ceremony, pipe ceremony, fishing quest, sweat lodge, probably some Sundance in the area, and definitely a fishing quest. And made very deep connection with themselves and with the family of all living things and with their own essence. Finding out who they are, why are they here, what's the purpose of this lifetime they have, which is the real purpose of a lot of the original Vision Quest. And through receiving that wisdom, they give back an appreciation through love and deep respect and ceremony to nature, and nature responds. When the mining came in, all that was disrupted. And the guardians of the sacredness of the site were very upset. And then wave nature came in, and we rediscovered we were going to be the same old thing, takers. But we discovered that actually there was something going on here that was far greater than we had realized. And we began to act on the message that we received by listening to what nature herself had to say about what this land was for. And through that, it became a model for what we would hope to see, ideally thousands of places like the Sacred Land Sanctuary in counties all over the United States and abroad, and be exemplars of having temples and churches of the earth, synagogues of the earth, that are places we go to for reconnection and learning how to be good partners with a big family of all living things. Pretty simple stuff. But how do you do it? Well, you do it by going there in a sacred way, deep respect, spend alone time, invoke the power of a sacred place, learning how the energy works through things like these seats, learn how to bond with that, have that be a vehicle for listening more deeply to the three natures of outer, inner, and true nature. And then through that begin to open up a much deeper capacity to be at one with nature and your home ecosystem and with your partners in this journey of life that we all share with the big family of all living things. So some things are being pioneered here, I think, that are quite important, potentially. Could really be part of the answer. I had to come back into balance with the big family of life. Very hard to do that if we don't have a larger picture of coming back into that kind of deep connection. Then it's theoretical, mental activity, which is helpful. But we need these days to go much deeper than that. So here's a way to do that. And a way to establish a Church of the Earth. This was done with just a few bucks from my retirement savings. I could have put it into some stocks and bonds. And then at this point in my life, I could receive the benefit of those savings and retire in a fairly comfortable way. But I thought, do I really want to put my savings into sterile stocks? They mean nothing. And I could put this into preserving sacred land. And then at some point in the future, hopefully the culture will wake up enough so I could reimburse. I get my retirement back. I'm just one little guy. Everyone can do something like that in their own area. So it becomes a more effective model for a grassroots movement to shift things in the direction of working with nature as a temple, a sacred place. Another big initiative that's been super helpful, I think, is the Wilderness Act. The National Wilderness Act. A friend of mine, Howard Sennheiser, from the old days, established an act that preserved wild lands, wild rivers, and wilderness areas like we have up here in the Sangre de Cristo. And the purpose of those is to go in and leave as if the mark of humans is minimal. Ideally, leave as little a trace as possible. So you're showing that you're very respecting nature and its natural flow of things to the max. That has some of the earmarks of a sacred perspective. So that's a huge assist to this concept that we've been developing with the rights of nature and with these specific temples of the earth that we have here. The first one, as I say, as far as we know, right here in Creston. I don't know of any other ones yet that have taken the full step to declare themselves in that way. But I'm sure they will be coming, and this will flower and flourish in the future. Any questions about this?
So what do we have legally that can protect these sacred areas that are determining themselves to be sacred sites? But how's that going to play out legally in the long run?
Well, it's a great question. And I guess we're all working out the answer. The Sacred Land Sanctuary, the route we originally had planned to take was to have a special kind of land trust set up. And the land trust would hold in perpetuity the idea of preserving land as sacred. And we've done land trusts all over the U.S. They've been very effective. And when you have a land trust, part of the goal is what's the intention for the land trust. In some cases, it's to preserve ranching and farming for future generations, the capacity to continue with that on into the future. In this case, we're talking about a very unique thing. So we begin looking for a land trust partner that could understand preserving the land as sacred and be assured that that would remain in place in perpetuity. Then we began to more recently look into the rights of nature type of approach, where the land itself owns itself. Personally, I'd like to see the land deeded over not just to nature or outer nature in the way we normally think of it, but also to Great Spirit and to the great mystery that gave birth to nature and all the rest of us. So that's an experiment. It's a brand new thing here in America for many of us. So we're trying to work out how to do this. But if it's true, I believe we have recently passed by the Supreme Court a ruling that said that companies and corporations have their own identity. I think it was called Citizens United, correct? Well, if a corporation can have an identity, so can nature. So can the ecosystem. So can the ecoregion. So this very same ruling that opened the door to a number of issues that we're all familiar with could be the opening of the door to beginning to honor nature as sacred in itself and providing a mechanism for the rights of nature to flourish. So that's another doorway we're looking into.
So it might be helpful for you to share the story when we were doing our early fundraising and we approached the Nature Conservancy. And this reveals the challenge that we were facing as a result of a lack of awareness, a lack of consciousness, and a lack of orientation towards sacred land and the sacredness of the earth. So maybe you might just share that little story when they came to review. Yeah.
Yeah, back in the day, I was very much involved with helping brand the term environment back in the 60s when we mostly just had schools of natural resources. We had forestry, sales management, mining. Most of our view of nature was based on resources, and resources is based on a taker mentality, not a partnership arrangement, not being part of a big family of life. So I began to look around for a word that would have that honoring of humans and nature being together in one system. And the word environment seemed like a good choice to embrace and honor the truth of all living things working together as a team. And if you look into ecosystem behavior, that's how ecosystems function. Nature ridden tooth and claw. What do you think about that one? How about nature collaborating with each other to produce an overall synergistic effect that produces far more beneficial life force effect than if you just relied on competition alone? Competition's in there, but it's probably only 10% of the system. 90% is collaboration, cooperation, and synergy. So in the same way we began to think along those lines, and I was lucky enough to help with the birthing of that concept, and it became known as the environmental movement. During those days, I became friends with the Nature Conservancy back in D.C. because I was living in D.C. trying to get all this going in the 60s. And one of my friends was the executive director of the Nature Conservancy. So some years later, when I ended up out here, I thought, well, instead of just my own savings and my retirement savings going into this, couldn't we get the Nature Conservancy involved? Because they have a revolving fund of money that can go into preserving a special place, and then they do some more general fundraising, and that goes into a pool of money that's available for other initiatives. So I contacted my old friends from the Conservancy, brought them back, and he recommended I connect with the local regional director, helped to set that up, and I brought the regional director down here. And I gave him a walk on the Sacred Land Sanctuary, just up the road. If you go up the road, you'll see some flags hung along the road. There's about roughly a mile from town all the way up to the campground, which is the sanctuary property. And then it goes up onto the cliffs, heads out for another half a mile to the west as well. And so I gave him a walk through the car over that whole area and some of those seats and beds I mentioned in the very beginning of this talk. And by the end of the afternoon, as we took that walk, my new friend from the Nature Conservancy turned to me and said, "Well, John, you've absolutely changed my life." I said, "Really? How so?" He said, "Well, this walk has changed my view of what nature is, how she expresses." That's the good news. The bad news is we don't have anything within our Board of Trustees and through our articles of incorporation for the Conservancy to protect and preserve sacred places. We can work with endangered species. We can work with endangered or threatened ecosystems. We can work with that kind of thing. But land, because of its inherent sacredness, we don't have that. I thought to myself, well, maybe it's time to create that. And now we have Jenny Mankey, who's taking some great steps to move that kind of concept along. But we also need land trusts that are set aside specifically for these churches of the earth or temples of the earth. We're taking a similar move in that direction by establishing a 501c8 type of organization, which is a spiritual fellowship. And just like the Catholic Church, as a church, can hold property as part of its process, the way of nature would be able to hold land in perpetuity as a temple, as a religious entity with that same personhood that we were talking about earlier. So we're definitely going to be doing that and establishing a global membership initiative called, so each of us as members of that group would be co-way sharers of the way. And we'll be launching that probably next month. And that would hold it would be held under a fellowship very similar to any church type organization or a fellowship type of organization. So for the first time, it would be held as a spiritual commitment to uncover both our inner spiritual truth and the outer expression of spiritual truth in nature itself, and reverse what originally began to be to mean when the first colonialists arrived on the shores of Turtle Island and began to demonize the native peoples. It's very important this be done by our culture in these times and not depend upon the indigenous peoples to yet have one more burden on their shoulders. We need to take ownership of this process ourselves, do it ourselves, with their help for sure. But it needs to be from our own hearts, our own bank accounts, our own money and time and effort and love and energy and support. So that's kind of what the Way of Nature is all about these days, as well as running retreats. The retreats work in harmony with that because they provide the means for how do you connect to nature? How do you work with nature connectivity? What's your toolkit for that? If you wanted to really connect deeply to nature, how would you go about that? Well, we've come up with a very simple approach. What's our God-given toolkit for connection? Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, balance and movement, the ability to perceive life force, the way we feel and the way we think. We call those the 9 fields of experience. And we've learned how to refine them. So you'll go through a process of first realizing you're disconnected from others, and then establishing initial connection through the power of intent. And then going deeper into that experience of connection, so you begin to have experience of being one with that which you're experiencing in partnership. And we call that the stage of communion, where you're still yourself, but there's also this unity at the same time. I think that in the Catholic Church, don't they call it First Communion? Stuff like that. Well, communion is not the ownership of any particular spiritual tradition. It's common to all. So after you go deep into the communion experience, you can actually have experience of profound unity and oneness. When you experience that profound unity and oneness, and that happens within your whole Vision Quest circle, or Sacred Passage circle, everything around you begins to rise as you are a part of it, and it is part of you. You're part of that body is part of you. Then authentic connection has been established. The heart opens. Naturally, you learn how to be deeply relaxed, surrendered, and present to that experience. And then we follow that entire process back into the base awareness, which is, you might say, the source awareness level of being. Different traditions have different names for that. Christians might call it the Godhead. In the Tibetan tradition, it might be called Rigpa, or the fundamental natural openness and clarity of the space of pure being. In Nandula Vedanta, it might be called that which holds the I am. In Taoist internal alchemy, it might be just referred to as the Tao. But in all these cases, there's a common ground aspect, and we try in the way of nature to teach from what all the great lineages have in common, not having to be a part of a particular religion. What do we share in common? What's the common ground? And through that, we've been able to give many people, probably thousands at this point, that experience of really being deeply one with the rest of life and the big family of all living things, without discriminating against something as being lesser. I recently went over to Europe. We have a number of wave nature groups over there. And they all gathered to meet up in Holland. And I said, John, we have a surprise for you. And I said, really? What's that? And I said, well, we would like to do a retreat here under your guidance. And we found a piece of land and some animals that have come back after being gone for over 10,000 years. I said, really? You brought some animals back? And I said, yeah. We backbred the cow into the auroch, or Taurus. The original auroch, the primordial breed you see painted on the walls of the caves in Europe, that was called the auroch. We call it now the auroch. It was the original sacred cow. So I got to put all my long-term students out in a group with probably a herd of a dozen or so aurochs surrounding them. Some of them very big and pretty intense looking, but nobody was hurt. And what an experience. So we've wandered a little bit off from the sacred sites of Creston, but I did want to mention that places like this, if it spreads around the country and abroad, then these can be places of profoundly deep reconnectivity where we learn how to rejoin the family of all living things and drop our discrimination against the rest of life and looking at the rest of life as just a resource to take from. But enter into a good, deep, loving, authentic relationship based on collaboration, synergy, and mutual respect. Pretty simple. Well, I think we've probably getting close to an hour or so. Maybe one last question, and then we'll quit. Well, either that's a sign of something, or maybe it's a sign of we're complete. Well, good to hang out with you all. Thanks for your presence today. Yep. Likewise. We've been at it together many years. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us about your shoes here?
Oh, yeah, before we quit.
I do have one quick question. Here at Hill, you said that's in Custom, but where is, can we visit that? Or is it?
Yes, you can. I should mention, and Jenny will go into more detail. When I say Pyramid Hill, I'm kind of joking a little bit because locally people began calling it Pyramid Mountain. But we've got a bunch of mountains around here, many of them over 14,000 feet. And the hill is what I call a hill. It's just up the road from my home. And believe me, it's not a mountain. It's a hill. So I've been rebranding as Pyramid Hill. But what Jenny and Hannah and a number of the local elders and leaders of the community have been able to pull off, with a bit of help from the Way of Nature, is a protection of this pyramidical shaped hill, which is found at the head. If you go to Willow Creek Way, do you know that road? If you head towards the where all the temples and the Hadakandi ashram, a couple of Tibetan centers are, the Zen Center, formerly Lindisfarne, that road that goes to all those places, and the Shume as well. And when you cross over Willow Creek, and then instead of going straight to all the temples, you take a left onto Willow Creek Road. Right in front of you rises a pyramidically shaped hill. That hill is the hill that has just been set aside as owning itself. One of the first examples of that in North America. So I highly recommend a visit over there. I think I'm not sure what the visiting process is these days for that, but Jenny, I'm sure, could answer that question. And a number of us have done work to protect that hill. In the meantime, as many people honored that place as sacred for quite a while. So it's a local history along those lines. And it is kind of the first of its type here in Crestone. And you probably know that Crestone itself is a town where the rights of nature is in the charter. That's one of the first places where that happened too, and we worked hard on that one. Got the governor to come down and sign off on that a few years back. So a lot going on in this side of things. One of our elders right back here, Mr. Leroy, has been helping with us in the POA area as well. So a lot happening along these lines. Oh, the shoes. So for authentic connection, barefoot is good, but can you see the base of the shoe? See the little golden circle? That's copper. If you know, anybody here know Qigong or Tai Chi? One of the basic things in Tai Chi and Qigong is the bubbling spring point, which is where the kidney meridian has a root. And from there, you make a very deep root into the earth. And your earth connectivity is very foundational. So in Turkey, they made this shoe with a copper circle in the base of the moccasin to emphasize and increase the conductivity of the chi connection between yourself and the earth. As you probably know, the number one reducer of inflammation is earth connectivity. Better than any drug. Earth connectivity is better than any drug in the market. Just simple, an hour a day of connection through the feet, and can change your life. Plus, you begin to unify with the Great Mother. Okay.
Yeah, I just might remind people that when you're ever in a group like this, they often say, let's make sure we send our roots down into the earth through the soles of our feet. And it's through that K1, kidney 1 point, the bubbling spring. And then you not only you can send your energy, but you also, through the roots, you absorb the energy. And that's just facilitated and accelerated by the copper.
And in case you wonder where your soul is,
Great. I guess that's complete. I wore an old T-shirt that John and I were. John was the leader of a 108-day journey through Nepal, Thailand, and Indonesia, and he calls me his senior student. I should have realized many years ago that I was never going to graduate, because he constantly refers to me as his senior student. But I wore this in honor of our journey. We took 11 Westerners on a 27-day trek through the Arun Valley of remote eastern Nepal, and we put them out on their solos at 16,000 feet elevation. And John suggested that one of the reasons that we were doing that was to get above the psychic pollution of humans. So, yeah. So you have to go above 12,000 feet to get above the psychic pollution. So
we were halfway between Mount Everest and Kanchenjunga, which is 28,500 feet high.
And Makalu also, and so there was a horseshoe of these 20,000 plus foot mountains, all radiating their energy for the solo sites at that elevation.
It's a great sacred passage.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a collector's item now.
I'm sure.